He was just a selfish man. She was a selfish woman. In this age of chaos and disorder, there is no place for those who stand on their own. But for an ordinary married couple, room can always be found.
Hey, this is Nick.
This is Nathan.
And this is David, and welcome to another episode of the Boss Podcast. On today's episode, we're reading Eileen Chang's Love in a Fallen City, the titled story from the book of the same name, in preparation for her novel Naked Earth. And this story is essentially about two people who kind of play the game of love and fall in love as World War II comes crashing down on them in Hong Kong. And the question we'll start with, for both of you, whoever wants to take it first, is this story itself of substance?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And partially that's just coming from the fact that I know very little about Chinese literature. And so I think I'm always just very interested in the different viewpoints and different cultural elements that come into what's kind of a classic tale, really. You have two people sort of courting and misunderstandings and going in and out, and then that's just mixed with a backdrop of World War II. And so I think just from a cultural information standpoint, I think it was hugely substantial to me. I do have a little bit of, it wouldn't be gripes, but maybe things where I thought it could have been paced a little bit better, but we can get into that a little more. Nathan, substantial? Yes, no?
I'm a little bit torn because I think I agree with you, Nick, about like it offers an interesting viewport into a time in history that I don't know a whole lot about, and into a culture and the way that things were, the way that life was being lived and the way that families operated. That being said, the first half of the story, I was pretty bored with it and the games that they're playing with each other, and I thought that for me her prose didn't really hold me in, and it wasn't until the abrupt change when the war starts and they're in Hong Kong that I really started to feel immersed in the story and started to feel something, derive something personal from it. So, I mean, ultimately, I think I would say that, yes, it's of substance in terms that it gave me a new lens to look at things, particularly war. But narratively and in the prose, it didn't really hold up that well for me. David?
Well, I would have to say ultimately no, because I didn't get as much out of it as the two of you did in terms of its insight into a culture and a place. I mean, I did get a little bit of that, but I fear that, or maybe I'm just sort of revolting against the idea that because something is good as a time capsule, then it has substance as fiction.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
And I think maybe that's where my hesitation comes from, because if this was something I was reading not for this podcast, I don't know if I would have made it to even when the war broke out, because I was bored and I wasn't drawn to the characters. I wasn't drawn to the narrative all that much. But like Nathan, once the war hit, I found that's when the author started to make connections and make perceptions that I thought were relevant and of interest and of substance.
Yeah, so why don't we lay out some of the actual characters and some of those details? So I guess the love story is between Liu Su, so a woman who is divorced, and she sort of comes from a very traditional Chinese family, and she's older, getting on in years, and the family is trying to...
Which is what, 30?
I think it's not even 30. I think it's like late 20s.
Yeah, I think she's like late 20s.
Yeah, because there's a comment in there about like she's very worried about crossing 30.
Yeah.
Right, so I think she's late 20s, and the family's trying to marry off a younger woman in the family. And the marriage prize, I guess, is Liu Yuan, who's sort of this interesting character from a background where he's born, I think, in London, doesn't actually have a lot of ties to mainland China. I think he came back when he was 24. So he has this sort of idealistic, fantastical view of what of what China is supposed to be. And I think ultimately he's very disappointed, and he becomes, I guess, a playboy, and I think he's drawn to Liu because he views her as a real Chinese. And she always says over and over that, she's a country bumpkin. But there's something about like the women that he sees as not having that quality. And so that's why Liu is sort of his prize. And it kind of takes the family by surprise. They don't expect that they would, or he would go for her over the younger woman. And then basically their courting starts to happen when she's sponsored by, I believe, a relative or a family friend to go to Hong Kong where Liu Yuan is.
And he more or less set that up.
Right.
He wanted her to come, and he encouraged the family friend to invite her.
So there's a lot of nuanced courting and trying to get into the head of the other person, and nobody really saying what they mean, and kind of whenever one of the two of them says what they mean, the other person doesn't believe it. How did you guys feel about that presentation? Did you believe it? Was it interesting?
I found it ultimately hurt my connection as a reader to the main character of Liu Su, because I never really understood what her goal, at least in the beginning, was outside of just escaping her family. And I never really understood what her true feelings were towards Liu Yuan either. Like it bounces back and forth. There's moments where it feels like they are truly in love, and then there's moments where she feels like she has sacrificed herself to this thing. And there's the quote at the beginning, which the quote that I read at the beginning about how they can both be selfish within their marriage because it allows them to kind of escape the sort of cultural trappings or the family trappings that they had before, but it's still not entirely clear how much she feels towards him.
Well, maybe we can try to answer that question. I mean, because it's an interesting question. What does she want in the story?
Yeah, so I view it as she really just has a pragmatic view, like you mentioned, David, that she wants to get away from her family. I think that's honestly like what's driving her the most. Mm-hmm. And Liu Yuan has totally non-pragmatic view. And even though there's a connection there, they have difficulty getting on the same page. And I actually found the nuance to be literally my favorite part about Eileen Chang in general. I've read this whole short story collection. I read another one of her novels, and we're starting to take a crack at Naked Earth. But like, I think that her benefit to the reader is she's trying to not necessarily provide every single possible detail, but a realistic view of things. And my favorite part in this whole story was actually when they're either mosquitoes or sandflies. And so they're sort of courting, they're having a great time, they're going out every day and every night, and they're getting along, and then they're on the beach and they're playing and swatting sandflies off of each other. And then at one point he goes too far, or she takes offense, and then she just leaves, and it throws the whole thing into a tailspin for like a week. And I read that the first time, and I was like, what the fuck? Like, there's no details here. Like, why did she get pissed? And then I just like think of like your own personal stuff, and like you're putting yourself out there, you're trying to like make some sort of middle ground, and then all of a sudden this tiny thing may happen that makes you think that, hey, this isn't what I thought it was, and then you completely overreact, and you then go back to like a power play. And I think that is kind of a very astute little detail that she did by actually not really giving a lot of detail. So I actually found that the nuance to be pretty impressive to me, because I feel like she didn't overdo it. It's very, very sparse at times, but I think that there's some truth in the way she outlines a lot of it.
I found that pretty interesting too. I mean, I think that the way that I read the protagonist, Liu Su, is that ultimately she wants to get away from her family, yes, but she really wants to be an individual. She wants to be a person with her own ideas and goals about things. And that's kind of her driving force. And the family and the society has all of these impositions about what she should do. And I think that's ultimately why she moves to Hong Kong, isn't because she loves Liu Yuan, but because she sees that as a path towards a freer life, a life that's freer of the social restraints that, I mean, are very,
They're super strong.
Super strong. I mean, what's that quote about a woman who deceives a man?
Yeah, let me grab it. It's like right here. Okay, so here's the quote. So basically, a woman who was tricked by a man deserved to die, while a woman who was tricked by a man was a whore. If a woman tried to trick a man but failed and then was tricked by him, that was whoredom twice over. Kill her and you'd only dirty the knife. So yeah, it's just actually like in other stories in Love in the Fallen City, I feel like Eileen Chang actually gets more direct and more harsh in some of her just societal observations and the way the characters go off. And that's actually also one of my favorite parts about her is it's a love story, but sometimes she just drops things like that are really meant to be, I imagine in 1940s China, like that was probably not an easy thing to write down and have, readers tackle.
You can imagine, I mean, that she's a fairly controversial figure. I mean, kind of taking on a traditional society and the role of women in a very traditional society.
Right.
So I think that we all kind of agree that the most, well, maybe Nick doesn't agree. David and I agree that
I don't agree with anything.
that the most important and most interesting part of the story is when the war starts. For me, that's what I feel is the most. I mean, it was interesting and it was fun to read. I don't know. I think I would have finished reading it even if it wasn't an assignment. But
this is an assignment.
Yeah, well, you
have to be in this fucking book club right now.
I've got to have something to say. But so for me, I was bored by the family interactions and all that stuff, and I was like, I'm kind of done with this. I'm confused. I'm confused who the fifth sister and the fourth wife are. I don't really there's no characterization of these people. They're just members in a list, and I'm like, I can't really figure all this out. It's just this overwhelming family structure that's impossible to decipher. But anyway, I was getting tired of that, and then the war hits, and the effect to me, and the way she writes it is literally like, what? I mean, they fall in love, they get an apartment, he leaves for London, and the next day, before she's had time to get any food or anything, bombs start falling. And the effect to me was like seeing how our day-to-day lives, as important as we see these things are, she wants to be an individual, she wants to find happiness, she wants security, as important these things are, that these things are, this is the way that we define our lives. It's like the pursuit of these little struggles. And then the war kind of changes the order of magnitude about what a struggle is. What does that mean? But ultimately, it's individuals existing, or it's the war existing within the context of these individuals' lives. And I think that's what was interesting to me, because when you read history so often, you see individuals existing within the context of these grand historical narratives. An individual may survive or die during a war, but the war is the important part. And she really, for me, flips that on its head and shows that the important things in a person's life, these things that become huge and overwhelming, like all of these sisters and wives, that those are the real things. It's like the war happened in the context of these other things.
I think that's what good war fiction does, is it individualizes and humanizes it, whereas history, like you said, if you're looking for history, it doesn't really have the time to do that unless it's something incredibly focused. But a good war fiction does individualize it and show how something can affect something seemingly so insignificant during wartime.
Yeah, I didn't realize that that's where this story was going. I mean, it's called Love in the Fallen City. I'm like, which city is going to fall?
You just thought it was like the fallen city inside our hearts or something?
Well, I actually thought it was going to be, like, I thought it was going to take place. Yeah. I thought it was going to take place in a city under siege. But the way that she leads up with all this banality, and then the war starts kind of without any preparation. It happens. It just hooked me. And I mean, the first thing I thought about in reading the second half of the story was like Syria, which is a country that's constantly under siege. And you just get so callous. And even when I see stories of people, it's just callous. It's like these people have been at war. Yeah. And you forget that they're still hoping to go to college. They're still hoping to find a wife. Those are still the important things. The war is an interruption of the important things.
Yeah, I buy that. Checks out.
feel like I just talked for a really long time there.
You nailed it. It's beautiful.
That's all I've got to say. All right.
I want to push back a little bit on the idea that, well, I agree that she does want to be an individual, and I think my issue is that she doesn't know what kind of individual she wants to be, and that makes it difficult. I mean, it's interesting to read about, but it's also difficult to feel some sort of connection. So, literally the last paragraph before the war begins, after Liu Yuan leaves and she's alone at the house, it says, "Peace and quiet is well and good, but apart from people she had no interests in life. All of her learning, such as it was, came from her aptitude for performing in the human sphere. She knew how to be a grave, good daughter-in-law, a fussy, caring mother. But now she was a warrior without a battlefield. How was she supposed to, quote-unquote, mind the house when there was nothing to mind? Raise children? Liu Yuan didn't want children. Economize and save for the future? There wasn't the slightest need for her to worry about money. So how would she while away all this time? Play mahjong with Mrs. Zhu? Watching operas? Start flirting with actors? Smoke opium? Go the route of the concubine?" She pulled herself up short and straightened her shoulders, clenching her clasped hands behind her back. It was not going to come to that. She was not that kind of person. She could control herself. But could she keep from going mad? It's a really interesting insight to a person that really has no idea who she is.
Yeah.
And I think, to add to Nathan's praise of the post-war, immediately once the war begins and Liu Yuan returns, I think she starts to find herself. I think the war actually helps her.
Because there's something tangible to struggle against.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the war helps both of them, right? I mean, it pulls them in the direction of each other. So she was sort of pragmatic and maybe, I don't want to say hollow, but just didn't have the time or the space to actually be thinking about herself.
Yeah. Well, once she gained independence, she didn't know what to do with it.
Right. I mean, that's sort of terrifying. Just if you've been under a set of harsh rules and expectations, and then suddenly you have just the time and space with nothing to fill it. I mean, I think that's actually what scares a lot of people. And so, like, having that just sort of that immediately given to you, I think that's a pretty, like, harsh thing for somebody's psyche to deal with.
Lucky for us, we fill that void with books.
Exactly. That just constant entertainment through print.
We just pass it off to someone else.
Yeah, actually, well, Nathan just gets reading assignments. We like our books. Nathan thinks they're hard.
I trudge them. I need something to struggle against.
That's right. You found your battlefield.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that in her situation, it's kind of an extreme case because things are so rigidly structured in a traditional Confucius society. But her a battle between individual and society is the paradox that we all deal with. I think, like, I don't think any of us really want to be free. I don't think we know what to do with it. And so she kind of went from one end of the spectrum entirely to the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah. It's cool to think about being free, but if you had the opportunity, you'd probably just be nuts.
You'd have to find something to enslave yourself to.
Yeah. Opium. It's probably opium.
Opium, yeah.
I would go with the concubine, personally. I mean, I would become one, is what I'm saying.
You would become, yeah.
Right. There we go. That's what I thought you were getting at. I think that's also, I kind of want to hit on a small detail of, like, the cultural stuff that I liked is the family details. Well, I agree with Nathan. After a while, you're sort of like, can we get to the slightly more interesting part of the story? But how open they are about just the rules and coupling up, I did find pretty shocking at some level, which is basically, she gets a divorce because her husband's beating her, but everyone's incredibly upset about that. They say that there's the law of the land, but there's actually, the law of marriage that sort of takes precedence. So even her own family didn't believe in her own divorce. And then there's just sort of this hierarchy of options where she can, like, ideally get married, but nobody think that's really possible. She can become somebody's mistress or concubine, but if that doesn't work out, then she's just sort of left hanging. But, like, the family's also okay with this. They're sort of like, well, she's older. If she doesn't make the cut for marriage, at least, maybe you could be somebody's second wife. There's...
Well,
there's just like an openness about that I found really sort of a little bit shocking. Just like, how is everyone totally cool with this?
But it speaks to a harshness of society. Like, there were realistic things, like they didn't have enough rice to feed that many people. They wouldn't be able to take care of her when she got older. And I mean, that's just a harsh reality. Like, people needed another family to take care of them. I mean, women needed another family, basically.
It's one of the oldest and the beginning reason for marriage, which was to make the family unit stronger by combining it with another family that had money or land or whatever, right? So it's still holding on to that old tradition of marriage, not out of love, but out of necessity or strength.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's totally strategic. Just putting yourself in those shoes to where you're just like a piece on the chessboard and you're just trying to basically couple up with anybody, or rather your family's trying to couple you up with anyone to get rid of you before you become an even bigger shame of the family. Like, that's kind of a lot of weight to carry around, right? And so, I don't know, I think one of the things that makes me feel that this is substantial is just the voice of Chang in the era making these comments. And I have to imagine that was kind of a against the grain thing. And, 1940s, even the US, like, it would be difficult for, I don't know, I guess something just opposite of society in terms of viewpoints to be written, coming from a woman, although there's certainly examples. But, in China, it's an even bigger uphill thing. So I guess that's why when I say it's shocking, I guess it's not necessarily shocking and you can't picture it, but just that, this was sort of popular fiction at the time.
Yeah, where was this published? It was published in
like Shanghai magazines, periodicals.
Yeah.
She wrote like a lot of these in her 20s.
Until the Cultural Revolution.
Right. And then her shift, which will be kind of fun to piece that together when we talk about Naked Earth on the next podcast, of after things sort of descended into communism, how she continued to basically use her same skill set, which is sort of diving into people's lives and the small details and small portraits, but under a totally different political regime. And so I think that's kind of also a testament to her craft. Is there's some stuff related to war and some stuff related to politics, but it's really just it's about the people and how they interact and the subtleties.
Yeah.
I think the more we talk about it and the more I flip through the book, the more I'm coming around to appreciating the nuances of the relationship. And I think that was my fault for not maybe like looking closer as I was reading.
Yeah, me too, actually.
Because I just as we're talking and I'm flipping through it, looking for quotes, and I'm finding like little idioms and little expressions and little conversations, and I'm a lot more drawn to what I think, Nick, you said earlier that you were most intrigued by, or at least what you liked the most, was that the nuance of their relationship and how they sort of communicate with one another, right? One of the early things that he says was something like, I don't understand myself, I don't understand what I'm saying, but I want you to understand me. And it's such a universal feeling, I think.
Yeah. Their first date, they went to a movie and nobody talked.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like your little thing about the little quips and stuff, and there's just sort of this awesome one towards the end where it's just, we were way too busy falling in love. How could we have found time to really love each other? Right? I mean, that's sort of this beautiful little piece of I don't know, just a nugget about relationships and stuff.
I see why she was a good script writer for films, because there's little lines like that, especially in the world of love, that I think would be good for a movie.
Yeah, and the whole structure of this, it's really, the bookends of it start off and sort of refer to it almost as a new age classic Chinese folktale. And so I think she's kind of lending it to the screen already, just in her structure. So I don't think she was really pushing bounds in terms of, I don't know, it's hard to tell with prose, right? We're working with translations, and I didn't think it necessarily shined there, but I think her stuff is, the nuance. And I always feel like when we get on these and we start talking, sometimes you guys are like, I didn't like it. And then I just basically cheerlead for the book the whole time. So we're just going to read a tons of like more stuff you guys might not like, and then I'll pitch it to you until you agree.
Maybe that's your struggle.
Yeah, it's my own fallen city. So I don't know what else. I mean, my favorite part, looking back at how she set it up, sort of before the war started. There's this quote from Liu Yuan. It's about the wall, and so he says, "I don't know why," said Liu Yuan, looking at her, "but this wall makes me think of the old sayings about the end of the world. Someday, when human civilization has completely been destroyed, when everything is burned, burst, utterly collapsed and ruined, maybe this wall will still be here. If at that time we can meet at this wall, then maybe, Leosu, you will honestly care about me, and I will honestly care about you." And so that was before the bombing started, and it sort of just foreshadows basically their need for some like higher level of chaos, some bigger event to sort of put their own relationship and interactions and relations to each other in focus.
So I've just been mulling over something that's come up a few times when you've been talking, and that's they're both sort of aimless for different reasons at the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
And they're both experiencing this sort of cultural shift. Like they're pulling away from a traditional framework.
Well, she's going from sort of east to west, and he's coming from the west going back to the east.
Yeah. And he's spent his whole life free, and now he's looking for, some attachment.
But I think they represent the same thing. I mean, they both are identified to some degree with traditional China. And that's the framework that she's trying to move away from that framework. He has moved away from it. He's trying to move back towards it, but they're both on that cusp. And because they're on the cusp, I think they feel they don't have the sort of the strength of that framework to support whatever meaning they need in their lives. And the war, I guess, provides maybe an immediate struggle for them to place themselves within.
Yeah, it's the big external event.
Does that bother you? That it's so Deus ex machina, kind of, almost?
No, not at all. I think it's... I don't actually feel like it is that way. I think it's the sort of malaise that they feel. They're not really moving with any urgency towards anything in particular. Makes a lot of sense. And maybe they were longing for an event like that.
Yeah. I mean, she kind of tips her hat towards just this general story, maybe not really being an original story. So she says at the end, Hong Kong's defeat had brought Laosu victory, but in this unreasonable world, who can distinguish cause from effect? Who knows which is which? Did a great city fall so that she could be vindicated? And sort of goes on to talk about, the great legends and sort of how they came to fall in love. And it's always amidst this huge, like, historical backdrop of turmoil. And so, like, is Laosu just a modern legend?
I loved that phrase because it's so ridiculously pompous.
Yeah.
But it's real. Like, all of us are the center of our own lives. We're not, if we're a part of something bigger, we're a part of something bigger in terms of ourselves. Which seems insane, but I think it's true.
You are your own legend. What?
Like as if she needed this war for her to fall in love with this guy. Like not the other way around. The war existed within the context of her finding a meaningful relationship with this other mortal being.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess the more we talk about that, maybe we should ask about the original question again. So, like, Nathan, do you think this is of substance now that we've talked about it a little more?
I generally have a greater appreciation for the books after we talk about it a bit. But I don't know. I still kind of feel the same because I registered my initial reactions to it. It's fairly middling. I think it made me interested to read her other stuff, and I think for the reasons that you noted is like her voice is a pretty sharp portal into this time period, which I am interested in just beforehand. So I'd like to see what else she wrote. This particular story was a little bit too deep on the family structure and a little bit too saccharine for me.
David, you?
Yeah, so I kind of agree with Nathan. I've I've come to appreciate the narrative and the nuance of character development more in our conversation, but I would stress emphasis on the qualifier some in the title of our podcast, so I would say it's of some substance. But after reading, because I also read 2 of the other stories in this book and liked them, and I'm looking forward to kind of seeing what she does with Naked Earth and with this sort of change in focus, which maybe, Nick, you can talk about a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm also looking forward to Naked Earth, and I've kind of cracked it a little bit. But so Naked Earth is Eileen Chang's novel written in the early 50s, talking about Maoist China. And so it was actually funded by like the U.S. Information Services. So I think at some point it was meant to be propaganda, but it's in the rear view. It's viewed as kind of a really deep, like, psychological tale of, you know, how people interact and the small behaviors that they have to sort of adjust within themselves when they're living in such a strong government regime. So it's kind of a lot deeper into like the political subject matter, but I think the focuses are similar, and I'm really looking forward to kind of breaking those down and the small nuances that she peppers throughout that novel. So I guess join us next time when we reconvene to talk about Eileen Chang's Naked Earth.
Thanks for listening, everybody. If you liked what you heard, please give us a positive rating on iTunes. It helps other people find the podcast. And as always, you can check us out online at our website, booksofsomesubstance.com, where you can sign up to get cool artwork, handwritten notice letters for the next book we're going to read, and just see some really cool stuff. You can also follow us on Twitter and now on Instagram at booksofsubstance. And we do have a Facebook page, which we update periodically. Again, thanks for listening. See you next time.